Today, we're presenting on the topic of the validity of primaries in the presidential election. I'm Ashton Rabindra, and my partner is Rohan Ipor. So just starting off with a brief introduction, an overview of our topic. Primaries are elections held by political parties to select their candidates for the general election. Today, we're interested in the voting mechanics of primaries from a class perspective and whether or not they're effective at ultimately electing the quote-unquote best president.
So before we dive into primaries from an age perspective, first we want to consider some of the general pros and cons of primaries that we came across in our research. Starting with the advantages of primaries, we have three main contentions. The first one are the benefits you get of a longer primary session. We found that sequential systems result in the highest probability of electing the most suitable candidate. It also gives lesser-known candidates a chance to slowly build support and bring new perspectives to the table, as well as allows voters to make more informed decisions. The second contention is that each state is going to have a voice in the primary process. Presidential aspirants interact with voters and officials from coast to coast, learning about the country and themselves in the process. And this goes a little bit in hand of the longer primary session season, since they have time to go around the country. And also, the staggered state-by-state system forces these candidates to address the unique issues and preferences of each state that they go to. And finally, the spoiler effect is avoided, which we will talk about more a little later. Early states provide a service by winnowing or narrowing the field of candidates without a clear message or the ability to organize a proper political campaign. And if we were to have a national primary with that many candidates, it would be incapable of producing a definitive winner.
Some criticism of primaries. The biggest one is that the current primary system only benefits richer candidates. From our research, we found that candidates with the most money win 91% of the time, and political spending hugely shifts policies towards the ways of the donors and away from the voice of the people. The size of one's wallet should not determine the strength of their voice in our democracy. Our second contention is that there's an unfair advantage in terms of primary order. The order of when state primaries occur has an unfair implication on the voting process. Iowa and New Hampshire dominate the nomination process and devalue later states' votes. Nominations are unduly influenced by elites and unrepresentative of the entire electorate. Candidates shape their policy around higher socioeconomic statuses and more extreme electorates of Iowa and New Hampshire. The last contention is that the current primary system suppresses voter turnout. Negative advertisements often have a demobilizing effect and decrease the likelihood of voter turnout. Campaign ads are often inaccurate and result in an uninformed decision, and voters within a state often don't know when their state is even hosting their local election.
So now let's move into a perspective that's a little more relevant to the things we learned in class. And we wanted to start with the problems of play framework in the shoes of a voter. So starting with that first part, which is the problems of players. So game discovery, what game are we playing? The game is obviously the election and the players are the voters. So the voters are going to need to know which election they're participating in what state, and what is at stake. They also need to know who the candidates are and what those candidates' positions are on the issues that are important to them. Next is strategy discovery. So what are the voters' good option of play? They need to know what their good options of play are. This includes understanding the positions of the candidates, again, on the issues that are most important to them, and determining which candidate best represents their interests. And then figuring out how the voters should play or cast their vote. This could involve considering issues, evaluating the candidate's qualifications, and deciding which candidate they think will best represent their interests, or which vote will help them put the candidate forth that's going to help them the most on those issues.
The second part of the problems of play framework is the problems of society and collectives. So the first thing to look at is explaining social behavior in terms of fashion, deception, communication, and conventions. So we need to understand why voters behave in certain ways. For example, why do some voters vote based on party affiliation while others vote based on the issues? And then on game behavior, which is what happens given the initial conditions of play, we need to understand how the initial conditions of the election affect what goes on throughout the primary season. This includes factors such as candidates, issues, rules of election, and as we discussed prior, the order of the state's primaries. Next is institution or game design. So what should the conditions and rules of the election be? And lastly is institution and design discovery. And this would involve exploring different options for the rules and conditions of the election, which is what we're doing today. This would consider different voting systems, such as first past the post or ranked choice voting, and evaluating the pros and cons of each choice.
So let's talk a little bit more about those problems of players. And when we're looking at the strategy selection and their consideration, it's going to depend on what type of primary election type they have. And the majority of states use plurality voting. The next most use majority voting. And there are some states that use top two, like California, Washington, and Florida. So we want to consider those types of voting.
Yeah, so further going into those main three types of voting, starting with plurality, the most common. Here, voters can individually select one candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. Majority voting is similar in the facet that voters still only select one candidate, but the candidate must receive a strict majority or above 50% of the votes to win. If no candidate receives a majority, a runoff election may be held. And lastly, and least common, is top two voting. All candidates compete in a single primary, and the two candidates with the most votes advance to general election regardless of party affiliation. The candidate here with the most votes in the general election wins.
So now we want to talk about, so what are the considerations of the top two main types of voting, which is plurality and majority voting? And how can we connect this to what we talked about in the problems of play framework? So with plurality voting, it encourages strategic voting, and we're going to talk about this in an exercise in just a second. It incentivizes voters to vote strategically rather than honestly. It also limits voter choice since they're often forced to choose between the two major parties. It can also be vulnerable to vote splitting, where candidates who sometimes act as spoilers are going to split the vote. And finally, polarization. Candidates may cater to the most extreme voters, and this is a problem in both. So with majority voting, it is mostly a winner-takes-all approach. A candidate who receives only a small majority of the votes is going to win all the delegates. And there also may be a lack of representation. For example, if a state has a large minority population, the majority candidate may not represent their interests or concerns. And again, there's polarization, so candidates may cater to the most extreme voters.
Now, looking at this through the lens of an exercise that we went through in class, consider the possibility that Trump runs for the Republican nomination in 2024, but fails to get it. In response, he runs as an independent and succeeds on getting on the ballot in both red and purple states. With Trump running as an independent, there could be a split in the conservative vote, which would benefit the Democratic nominee. It would benefit the Democratic nominee by drawing support away from the Republican nominee, potentially resulting in a loss for the GOP. Some voters may not have been enthusiastic, could be motivated by Trump's candidacy, which would in turn increase voter turnout. But the presence of a strong independent candidate like Trump typically impacts the strategies and messaging of major party candidates.
So another thing that we thought was important to bring up was Arrow's impossibility theorem, which we learned about in class. It has these three basic properties. If every voter prefers X over Y, then the group prefers X over Y. If every voter's preference between X and Y remains unchanged, then the group's preference between X and Y also has to remain unchanged, regardless of other changes in preferences. And finally, no single voter can dictate the group's preference.
So on this topic, we agree with the professor's statements in class, which is that the strategic manipulation is not a lamentable flaw in a voting system. Strategic manipulation is a result of a rational action by the agent, and as long as rational voters exist, there will always be strategic manipulation. We should aim to remove biases and other effects inherent in the system, not strategic manipulation.
Yep. And the reason we brought up Arrow's impossibility theorem is because we wanted to show this point, which is most of these voting systems are going to have the possibility of strategic manipulation. Even cardinal systems still cannot be or are not always subject to Arrow's impossibility theorem. So we kind of have to see strategic manipulation as something that's just going to be part of voting, and instead, agreeing with Professor Kimbrough, we should try to remove biases and other effects or negative effects that are inherent in the system. Which brings us to our conclusion, which is primary elections are pretty much necessary in our voting system. And I know we went through just now and showed that there are all these flaws, but we believe these flaws are better emphasized in primaries than our final presidential election. If you imagine our final presidential election being anything like our primaries, I think it's pretty clear that we wouldn't really be able to come to a really good solution every single time. So we almost see it as like a necessary evil. And then strategic manipulation, like we said earlier, is going to be inevitable, especially when we analyze it from a problems of play perspective. There's always going to be a way for voters to strategically manipulate their vote, as well as play in a way, I guess, that's not truly honest to to what's most important to them. And finally, improvement efforts should be focused on eliminating these unfair biases, such as what we talked about earlier. Advantages to candidates with money, where we found that 91% of the time candidates with more money would win. The advantage of state primary order, as well as advertisements suppressing voter turnout. And yeah, these are the references we used throughout our research and to make this presentation. Thank you for listening.